Hello, 7th and 8th grade. We are getting into a brand new chapter today, and it's going to be very close to history as your parents knew it. So many of your parents were born in the 70s or 80s. So this is a chance to find out what life was like when they were growing up. Not quite your age, but when they were growing up. So this is going to be really interesting. Get some good information. And the nice thing about this chapter is we start getting into some of the positive effects of recent history as well, not just war. Okay, so let's start off with the first president of the 1980s, which was Ronald Reagan. He was chosen after being governor of California. Now, Ronald Reagan had a long career in politics, but he didn't start out as a politician. He started out as an actor. He was an actor. He was a Democrat for most of his young life. And then he was hired to be the union head of the Screen Actors Guild. So he worked in politics that way. He was a union rep. He worked in Hollywood for much of his adult life. And then he decided that things needed to change. He saw that California was kind of struggling, and he ended up leaving the Democratic Party because he believed that they were on the wrong path, and he joined the Republican Party instead and became governor of California. So he had some solid political experience, but he was chosen to run against Jimmy Carter. Now, he had actually been, earmarked to run before this, but he didn't make it all the way to the final candidacy. Before someone's chosen to be a candidate for president, they have to go through primaries first, which is people in the different parties. They have to choose between multiple people who's actually going to run. And he did run before that. That was between Nixon and might have been between, yeah, I think it was between him and Nixon that first time for the Republican ticket. And then he tried again when it was Jimmy Carter was in office. So Jimmy Carter was running as the incumbent. The incumbent is the person who already has the job, and they're just looking for a re-election or being rehired for the same job. Now, remember that worldwide, Jimmy Carter was not terribly respected. He was respected as a good man, but as a weak leader. And then in the Middle East, he was seen as the devil. So, there was really not a whole lot of love for him. I also want to remind you that when it came down to the Nobel Peace Prize, he was ghosted. The two people who signed the Nobel Peace or signed the agreement, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, they both got the Nobel Peace Prize, but Jimmy Carter did not, even though he was the one that facilitated that whole thing. So this is up for grabs. This election is between Jimmy Carter, who some people blamed for the OPEC oil crisis, even though it started before him. They were angry because he didn't try to increase oil production in the United States, instead wanted to go solar. He, pushed that whole idea of solar, which was way more expensive and very inefficient. And then they also looked at him as being very weak because of the Iran hostage situation. The hostages had been in basically camp or, in jail for well over 144 days that they were kept in Iran. These are people who were on American soil in Iran inside of the U.S. Embassy. The embassy was overrun. These people were taken and they were arrested and they were kept as hostages. Hostage means that they would be released if money was paid for them. And Jimmy Carter could not seem to get their release. Ronald Reagan campaigned on this, and he said, look, our leader of the United States should be able to say, you can't take our people. In fact, nobody should be taking our people because they're afraid of the president of the United States. We should say things like, if you don't return our people, we will bomb you into smithereens. That was just it. And then there was a novelty song for a while called Bomb Iran, to the tune of Barbara Ann from the 1950s. So Ronald Reagan is campaigning on this idea of, we need to free our hostages. We need to be strong on the military stage. We need to be strong on the world stage. And he came across as the choice of people who wanted to see a strong leader. Okay. So he told the people he wanted to return America to her traditional values and restore her military strength at home and abroad. And he is going to run with the former head of the CIA, George Bush. Does the slogan look familiar? Our current president uses that partial slogan. He says, "Make America Great Again." This is from Reagan and Bush in 1980. Okay. Now, Ronald Reagan was given this name, the Great Communicator, even though sometimes he would say and a lot when he was trying to think on his feet. But overall, he could memorize a script from his speechwriters. Usually, a politician does not write their own speeches. They basically have a meeting where they talk about what they want to say, and then a speechwriter writes that all down for them. They go through the speech. They say, okay, I like this, I don't like this, cross this out, and then they edit it themselves, and then they rewrite it for them, and it's put up on a teleprompter now. So they read a speech that has been worked on for a very long period of time that they've had input on, but they didn't necessarily write it. Ronald Reagan was a former actor, so he could memorize these scripts very easily and deliver them powerfully. He did kind of fade when he was asked things, kind of off the cuff, and he would go, well, but that's okay. I mean, everybody does that. I do that, and I'm talking to you about stuff I've been teaching for 18 years, so it happens. Okay, going on to the next one. Conservative political action groups, also known as PACs, okay, a political action group or a political action committee. Conservative political action groups of the 80s encouraged people to vote and to return to traditional values. The Moral Majority was the largest PAC, political action committee, of the 1980s. Jerry Falwell was a pastor and a college president in Virginia. And he was really pushing for churches and church members to get out and vote. He said, look, you don't like what's happened when the Democrats have been in power, or the liberals have been in power. I really should say liberals instead of Democrats, because there are plenty of Democrats who are a little more conservative, and a lot of Republicans who are called rhinos, Republican in name only, because they're not really conservative, they're more liberal. So he was trying to get people to vote in a more conservative manner, meaning to conserve traditional values, okay, to conserve the original intent of the Constitution. That's what that was all about. So he really pushed for Christians to get out and vote. He says, you know what, this garbage about Christians not being able to vote, or shouldn't be able to vote, or shouldn't worry about voting because God's in charge. Well, God's in charge, yes, but he also gave us the right to vote. I mean, we have the right to make statements. If you look back at the Old Testament, it wasn't so much about voting, okay, because that's kind of a newer invention, but it was about people could approach the king and the judges and say, what is going on here? What are you doing? Remember Nathan approaching David and saying, wow, you have messed up. Remember Samuel approached Saul and said, wow, you have messed up. We had, in Old Testament, there were representatives of God who went and talked to the leaders and said, you need to stop doing what you're doing because you're out of God's will. You have to make a change. And there were individual people who weren't necessarily involved with the religious leadership of the day, who would approach the kings and say, I disagree with what you did here. And they were not punished for speaking their mind. So we have a long background as human beings of being able to approach our leadership and saying, what you're doing is negatively affecting me. And so Falwell is telling Christians, you need to be open about how you're being negatively affected by the way things are being run. Now, at the time, remember, there's a lot of people out of work. There's a lot of money going into social welfare programs to encourage people who aren't working to remain not working and to remain on the government payout, because it's a little easier than going to work every day, even though you don't make as much money, not even close to enough money to live on. He says, look at what's being taught in the public schools. Parents basically gave up their rights to choose what was taught in the schools during the times of LBJ, and people gave up a lot of those rights. And he says, look at what's happened. You're not happy with what your child's learning. Evolution was being taught as a scientific fact instead of a scientific, well, really just a hypothesis, because there's no way to actually prove it using the scientific method. And it was being taught as scientific fact based on, we're all going to just agree that this is the truth, even though there's so many holes in there. It's like Swiss cheese. So we had spiritual leadership in the United States at the time saying we need to go back to conservative traditional values and start raising our children in a way that is honoring to God. Phyllis Schlafly, she was a constitutional lawyer. So this is a woman who went through school and got her law degree and was, passed the bar. She was a lawyer, and she backed Ronald Reagan for president. Now, she has since been really kind of smeared in American culture as being this just very hard-nosed. She just wants women to stay at home, barefoot and pregnant and in the kitchen. That is not what she was promoting at all. But she was very much against the Equal Rights Amendment, because the Equal Rights Amendment was only 2 lines, and it could be interpreted a variety of ways. And she said that is not tied down enough. That is not clear enough. That is going to open the door for a lot of women to be taken advantage of. And so she wanted to shut that down. The feminists of the day who were pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment hated her. And they're the ones that accused her of being this, you believe every woman should stay at home. She wasn't staying at home. You believe that women shouldn't be educated. She was educated. You don't believe that women are equal to men. She was working at a job that was typically male before, this time. So all of their arguments for Phyllis Schlafly really don't add up. Okay, at the age of 69, Ronald Reagan was the oldest man ever to be elected president of the United States. There were other presidents who were older than him when they left the office, but he is the oldest to be elected at 69. And of course, his running mate was George Herbert Walker Bush. On the same day that Reagan was inaugurated, because Reagan had campaigned on this idea, look, step 1, I get elected. Step 2, I take the oath of office and I'm inaugurated. Step 3, we start dropping bombs on Iran. Yeah, that was what he was going with. That's what we're going to start. We start bombing immediately. And Iran got scared. Here was a man who was actually strong. Now, the people who disagreed with Reagan said they were just terrified because they think he's crazy. No, they thought he was strong. The same day that Reagan was inaugurated, the 52 hostages in Tehran is their capital, were released after 444 days of captivity. I think I said 144 earlier. I'm sorry, it's 444. Reagan had promised military action to free them. He said, bomb. Okay? Bomb. I will bomb Iran. We will start bombing Iran. And before you knew it, same day as the inauguration, the 52 hostages were released. Ronald Reagan was the first president since Dwight D. Eisenhower to serve 2 four-year terms. He wasn't the first to be reelected. Nixon was, but he had to leave because he disgraced himself horribly and disgraced the entire Republican Party at the same time. Reagan is trying to bring the honesty back to the Republican Party, the strength back to the Republican Party. He wants to run things appropriately. So he is the first one since Dwight Eisenhower to serve 2 four-year terms. Margaret Thatcher was the conservative prime minister of England. She got along very well with Queen Elizabeth II, and she had the same same vision of strong traditional values, limited government, and strength against communism. And as much as she did for England, people, when they look back on her, they call her the Iron Butterfly because she was so strong, but yet she was very feminine. She at one time said they would never see a female prime minister in England, but then she got voted in as prime minister, so she was wrong on that prediction. But she also had a very strong sense of we need to have military strength to make sure our country is protected. And that was tested almost immediately after she became prime minister with one of the English territories, the Falkland Islands off of South America, were being invaded. Margaret Thatcher immediately sent the military there, the English military there, to stop the invasion, and they pushed all of those invaders back onto South America. They were a communist group that were trying to invade, and she pushed them right back, and she basically showed everybody, you don't mess with England. We are still strong. Just because you think a woman can't do this job doesn't mean I can't. She's a female prime minister. We have a queen of England. We are going to be the strong ladies here. And so she did that same vision of strong traditional values. Now, some people are going to twist it, because people always do, that if you have limited government, you have strength against communism, strong traditional values, it means you hate people. That's not what it means. It means that you believe that people are intelligent enough and are strong enough to build their own lives without government interference. That's the biggest difference between conservatives and liberals. Liberals believe that the government needs to help everyone, and everyone needs the government to help them. The conservatives say, no, you don't need us. We're here in case of emergency, but you are strong enough to do it on your own. Okay, Thomas Sowell, who, if you have Facebook, or I don't know if he's on Instagram, he's definitely on Twitter. He's a great person to follow. He was a brilliant black economist, still is brilliant black economist of the late 20th century. He effectively argued that careless welfare programs actually hurt ethnic minorities and destroyed the family and the work ethic in the inner cities. And this is something that was the exact opposite of what the liberal media was saying. He said, no. Every time a black family gets involved in government handout, it ends up destroying them. And he gave some really good examples. For instance, for welfare, if a mom, dad, and children are all together, they get a significantly smaller welfare check to help them through their hard times than if a woman is single and has a child. She gets more money because she's single. So people learn from that, and you end up having the breakdown of the poorer families, okay? Not just black families, because I don't want to say it's just black families, because it's the poor people, it doesn't matter what color, okay? Poverty is poverty. But the idea that you can make more money if you didn't have an intact family really encouraged people not to have intact families. And the more children you had, the more money you got, so people had more children. And it just got to the point where Thomas Sowell is like, what are you guys doing? You're giving money out to encourage people not to work. And we need everybody to work, because when you work, you take more pride in your home, in yourself, in the job that you do. The more you work, and then you also get the inspiration to go out on your own and do a job on your own. If you see a need, you want to fulfill it. Reaganomics. This was Reagan's economic plan. So he's believed that budget should be balanced. In other words, you should have more coming in than you have going out. You need to balance that budget. Money supply should be stable. So you should have the money coming in to help you to pay off those bills. When we have individuals, like you guys are in junior high right now, you don't really have to worry about paying bills, but your parents do. And so they need to make sure that their money supply is stable. If their pay gets cut, their money supply becomes unstable, and then they begin to scramble looking for different ways to pay their bills, okay? Because everybody has bills to pay. So your parents have a budget. They need to make sure that their money supply is stable. For a lot of adults, that means having to work 2 or 3 jobs to make enough money to pay rent, to pay food, to pay for insurance, to pay for school, to pay for clothing. So I've had a lot of parents who've worked multiple jobs to make sure their kids could go to a good school. And then we hear from people in the media who have no clue what's going on in the real world, making statements like Christian schools are only for rich people. And I'm like, I don't even know any rich people. Sorry. Well, I know a couple, but and honestly, the wealthier people who have children in our school are very, very generous. And they've even They've helped not just our school, but helped other students at our school. So people need balanced budgets. People need a money supply that needs to be stable. And Reagan understood this, and he wanted to apply that basic idea that people have in their homes to government. Next, he wanted trade and business to be free from government regulation, because every time there's a regulation attached to a business or like a manufacturing plant, a home business, whatever, every time there's a regulation attached, that is money that is taken away from that business because people have to pay for those regulations. For instance, if you wanted to make a pizza, there's over 100 regulations attached to making a pizza, because there's regulation for how the cheese is made, how it's delivered, how it's taxed, how the tomatoes are made or grown, how they're delivered, how they're taxed. You have all of these different regulations. So the price of the ultimate product goes up. And then the store itself has multiple regulations that they have to follow, including even to the point of the size of their sign can be regulated by a state or local government. The federal government had a budget deficit. That means they had more money going out than coming in. Okay, it spent more money than it received in taxes, and they had to borrow to cover the difference to continue running the government. So this is deficit spending. It's not a good place to be. You don't want to be here. Okay. Unfortunately, our government has gotten to that point. A lot of that can be traced back to LBJ, because he signed everything into law. I was only about, it was the first year I was married. Mr. Us worked nights, and I stayed up most nights so I could sleep in the daytime when he came home. And I watched a documentary once on LBJ, and they just went through all the different bills and everything that he signed. And I'm like, good grief. And it was like really obvious that this is where a lot of our deficit came from, was LBJ just signing everything into law. Okay, during the Carter years, the government continued to print more money to meet its obligation, and we already know that's called inflation. Inflation soared. When inflation soars, that means the prices of everything go up. When the prices of everything go up, unemployment increases as well, because the stores who are trying to continue to run have to let somebody go and use their paycheck to pay the bills. Inflation is not a good thing. After 12 yearly deficits in a row, the United States had a huge national debt. The total amount owed from past deficits. That's all the deficits from the previous 12 years. And people today like to say, well, Reagan had a higher deficit when he was in office than anybody else. He is getting the end of 12 yearly deficits in a row, and he's going to try and pay down that national debt. So Reagan convinced Congress to enact the largest tax cut in American history, 25% over a 3-year period. Why cut taxes at a time when the government needs more money? There is a really good reason for this. You ready? When people have more money in their pocket, they spend more money. And when they spend more money, that money is taxed. Not for income tax. This was an income tax cut. But when you go to the store, you're paying sales tax. You get where I'm going here? So the more money people have in their pockets, the more money they're going to spend at the store. Now, they're not wasting their money when they spend it at the store. Let's talk about what people use that money for when they have more money in their pocket and they can go to the store. They can use that money for home improvements. So they can go to places like Home Depot, Walmart, or a local mom and pop hardware store, and they can fix up their house. They're using that money for their benefit, but they're still spending that money, and they're allowing for that tax money to go back into the coffers of the United States government. When people get a tax cut, they tend to spend the money, and the United States ends up getting some money to pay off their bills. That's why tax cuts are a great idea. The only people who don't like tax cuts are the people who are concerned that those tax cuts are going to hurt people who are on welfare programs, who are not contributing into the taxation of the United States. The tax cuts are really just for people who work. The people who don't work and who are on welfare, don't get a benefit from tax cuts, but they get benefits all the time. They just don't get a benefit from the tax cut. Now, because the average American had more money to spend, guess what happened to the economy? It began to grow and it created more jobs. Because the personal income tax went down, people had more money to spend and they spent more money in stores, and then stores got more money and they hired more people to work at their stores. This creates more jobs. So the tax cut was a good idea. By the end of 1982, unemployment had dropped from 11% to 5%. Oh my goodness. It dropped. It worked. It worked. And people are still fighting over this and saying, no, we don't want to do tax cuts because it just hurts the people who are the poorest. It really doesn't, because guess what? The people who are the poorest now have a chance to go get a job. Federalism. This is the system of government that is laid out in the Constitution. And during Reagan's time, he's going to bring people back to the idea of a federalist system, because before this, starting with LBJ and Kennedy, you had more and more people looking to the central government for help. This actually started way back in FDR's day, when he really wanted the central government to be the most important part of the government. Reagan is going to say, hey, states, it's time for you to take some of this responsibility on for yourself. That is how it was set up in the first place. That's the way it's supposed to be. We are supposed to have multiple forms of government that can help us and that we can help in turn. Okay, so for instance, for our local government, that's supposed to take care of our local streets and schools and our fire department and a police department. Then we have state government that takes care of the statewide issues. Then we have a federal government that takes care of our whole country issues. It's supposed to be split into multiple parts so that it works a little more efficiently. So this is decision making that's supposed to be made equally among national, state, and local governments. That is federalism. And that's what's set up in the Constitution. We are federal, split government, republic, meaning we hire representatives. New federalism. This is Reagan's desire for individual states to assume more responsibility for government programs. So it aimed to give more power to the state governments. What ended up happening is a lot of state governments had depended so much on federal funds that they began to just cut whatever they felt should be covered by the federal government. As a result, you ended up with a big mess in some states like California. Okay, I'm going to talk about what happened in California at the time, because I was actually living in Arizona for most of this, but California for part of it. So let me tell you what happened in California. And I just have to be really honest with you guys. I was a liberal during this time, so I didn't understand a lot of what was going on. I was just listening to what people who were in the media and entertainment industry were saying, and I believed what they said because, they were funny. So anyway, with this new federalism, California basically shut down a lot of really important medical facilities that were for people who had psychoses, people who were schizophrenic or had multiple personality disorder, things like that. Really, really important facilities that kept people off the streets. Reagan said, okay, states, we are going to pull away because those are actually state-run institutions. So you need to raise the money yourself to run your state-run institutions. You should not be getting federal money for your state-run institutions, so we're pulling away. And we're going to use the central government money to take care of the country as a whole. So this is your job. You take care of these facilities. States like California said the federal government isn't giving us any more money, so we can't afford to run this place anymore. So they just closed these institutions down and turned these people out into the street and said it's all Reagan's fault. And so comedians started this thing called, I've just remembered it and forgot it again that fast. It was comic relief. And they did these long concerts where they had different comedians from all over the United States raising money for homelessness, because homelessness had become a huge problem, because really a lot of it was because of these institutions just being emptied. And they blamed Reagan flat out, blamed him, even though it was the states that were actually shutting these doors. Let me just put it to you now that I'm more of an adult. I'm more grown up now. Let's go back in time, shall we? Let's pretend for just a second that when Reagan said, okay, we are going to cut federal spending on these state facilities, why didn't the states say, okay, everybody, we need to raise money for our state facilities, and then comic relief helped state facilities instead? Instead of waiting until there was a homelessness problem and looking for someone to blame, they could have gotten this off at the very beginning. They could have cut it off, but they didn't, because they were so busy blaming, so busy just saying, okay, well, we're not getting the money. We're cutting everybody off. We're kicking everybody out. They didn't raise the money ahead of time. They waited until there was a homelessness population problem. Then they pushed forward. And that just, as an adult now, frustrates me, that people would be willing to spend money to fix the problem that could have been fixed before it became a problem. Okay, I'm going to talk about the ERA just really quick. In 1982, the feminist movement made a final push to add the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was partnered with a lot of different groups. ERA is the Equal Rights Amendment, but there were a lot of feminist groups and even groups that didn't include women who made deals with women's groups saying, if you help, we'll help you get your thing passed if you help us get our thing passed, kind of thing. It's quid pro quo. And then they wanted this like 2 lines added to the Constitution. Again, Phyllis Schlafly was one of the people who said, we don't need those 2 lines added to the Constitution. This is about an amendment being added to. And according to her, she's a lawyer, saying, the Constitution already protects women. It already does. I mean, with the right to vote, we get all those protections in the Constitution already. We don't need these extra 2 lines, which could open women up to a whole can of worms that we can't even foresee right now. So she was against it. A majority of people in the United States were actually against the ERA, but the feminists and the groups that were pushing for the ERA were very, very vocal, but it ended up not passing. The feminists claimed that the new law would ban discrimination on the basis of sex and called for unrestricted abortion and a role for women in military combat. Unrestricted abortion means a woman could go in and get an abortion for any reason. Now, when Roe versus Wade was first passed, it was unrestricted abortion all the way up to birth. That was the original reading of Roe versus Wade. Since then, Roe versus Wade was restricted over time to, okay, no abortions up to birth, no abortions in the 3rd trimester, no abortions when a child can actually live outside the womb, no abortions after 20 weeks. But abortion rights activists have really pushed that, and they've always included, if the mother's life is in danger. So the feminists called for this because they wanted unrestricted abortions. Today, they go beyond that and say, we want abortion on demand and without apology. They believe it is a medical procedure for the woman only. And unfortunately, they are teaching today that a woman who has a child cannot possibly become everything she should be, especially if she has that child young. So a woman who has a child at a young age, like say 18 or 16, that she could never actually become anything great because she is saddled with a child. Children are not a burden, they are a blessing. And so when people say something like that, it hurts the children who are born to young mothers. It hurts young mothers who have actually proven over and over again that they can actually work and get really good jobs and move up in their career and get an education, even with having a small child. Women do it all the time. But today's abortion activists use those women as victims. They say they're victims and they push that idea of victimhood. And they don't want women to have children before they are like 30. Okay. They're pushing the idea of we know better than you when to have a child. Now, take a look at some of these signs. One says housewives are unpaid slaves. This is something that was not actually believed in the United States until about the 50s and 60s when feminism first really took off. Before that, women who were homemakers were seen as working a job. That was their job. That was everything. In fact, if you read Little Women and then read Jo's Boys, which is both written by Louisa May Alcott, she actually trains young women how to be great homemakers. She runs a school and she also writes. But all three of those things go together, okay, for Louisa May Alcott's character, Jo. So she doesn't teach that women are oppressed, but she does encourage women, okay, you need to learn how to create a home and be a doctor. You need to learn how to create a home and be a writer. As for the boys in those pieces of literature, they are to be respectful of the women who create the home, and they're also the ones to provide the home itself. Okay, so it's a pattern of behavior where people work as partners, where a home is created by both the man and the woman as they marry and create a home. So oppressed women, please, oppressed women, don't cook dinner, starve a rat today. The idea that any woman who's married, her husband's automatically a rat. And then, oh, this one, end human sacrifice, don't get married. Washing diapers is not fulfilling. That is true. It's not fulfilling. But holding your baby in your lap and singing to it is fulfilling. Teaching your baby the ABCs is fulfilling. So it is not human sacrifice for a woman to get married and have children. Stop it. You know what is human sacrifice? Aborting a baby because you want to have a stronger career. Okay. Now, in order to be made an amendment, the ERA needed to be ratified by 38 out of 50 states. By June 30th, 1982, the deadline for the ERA's ratification, only 35 states had approved it. It was not desired. You notice that the states that wanted it the most have a really, really high population, and they also had a very high presence of feminism. They just kind of glommed onto these big cities. So we are done for today. We talked for quite a long time, but I wanted to get finished through this note. So have a really good day. Don't forget tomorrow's Wednesday, so that's your day to do any kind of catch-up work. That's the day I do my catch-up work. I can't do all the grading without taking a day to actually work on that. Keep in mind that I'm not asking you to send me any more grading via email. You can just put it in your book and then turn your whole book in when we're done. We only have 2 more chapters left. So let's get that done and then you can turn it in, and that should free up your computers and for lecture time and be a little less stressful to you and your families. Okay, so I will see you again on Thursday. Get your homework done a little bit at a time so you're not getting swamped. I'll talk to you later. Bye.